time for our morning Bible study to begin. I'd like to say it's good to be here. It's good to see everyone out. Excuse me. We do appreciate your presence this morning. We want to extend a welcome to our visitor that came in. I'm happy to introduce myself, but want to make a welcome to you. Good to have you with us, as always. And of course, we'll still want to remember those that we know of that are sick in our prayers. Brother Griffith, would you open with a word of prayer for us, please?
Heavenly Father, thank you for allowing us all to be here this morning. What we learn from Bob's going to teach to us is most beneficial, right according to your word, Lord. So we learn a lot from it. We do this always, we guide our direction. That's my prayer.
Amen. We're not coming to a part of our study that what we have been studying in the book of Genesis. Of course, we went through the creation. We went through the flood. We've gone through events after the flood, including the Tower of Babel. We've been talking probably the past several weeks about the life of Abraham and him being called out of the Ur of Chaldees, or called out of Iraq, as we would call it today, to wander in a land that God had promised to give to Abraham's seed. And so it's not seeds as in plural, but seed has that one. So we finally made it to Genesis chapter 22. Basically, since Abraham has left the Ur of Chaldees, we have now covered 49 years, 50 years of Abraham's life. And this is the event that it has been leading up to. You would say that God has spent years, and literally years, prepping Abraham for this event. And so we find as we go through this, even though a lot of times we read it more as a narrative and a story, you're going to be surprised at how parallel this is to the life and coming and death and resurrection of Jesus Christ. This is a shadow, if you will, of things to come. And it was really amazing. And there were some things as we studied this that never really thought about it. And then as it all kind of fits together, you'll see that God's plan is intact. God's plan's always been intact since Genesis chapter 3 and verse 15. And it doesn't matter if man tries to interfere with that plan or not. God's plan is still going to be God's plan. He's going to carry it out. And so we find as we read this, it's going to be very interesting when you look at the types and shadows that's involved here in this sacrifice of Isaac. And I'll say it like that because we know Abraham intended to sacrifice Isaac. I can tell you by reading this that Abraham put forth what is called deliberate intent to carry out what God had commanded him to do. And so we find as we look at this, we'll begin here, and I'll start reading a few verses, and I'll call on a few of you brothers to read a few verses here. And we'll start in Genesis chapter 22. This is taking place somewhere around 1872 BC, or thereabouts. We know the flood took place somewhere around 2348 BC, so we're probably somewhere around 500 years, 475, 500 years on this side of the flood. In the grand scheme of things, it has not been that very long, has it? When we think about it, we think about Bible history because we know there are characters that lived in the Bible some 969 years. So, in the grand scheme of things, it really hadn't been that long from the time of the flood. And so verse 1 says in Genesis chapter 22, "And it came to pass after these things that God did tempt Abraham and said unto him, Abraham, and he said, Behold, here am I. And he said, Take now thy son, thy only son, Isaac, whom thou lovest, and get thee into the land of Moriah, and offer him there for a burnt offering upon one of the mountains which I will tell of thee." Right in these first three verses, first couple of verses, we find there's a whole lot of thought, there's a whole lot of study we could do right here. Okay, I would imagine you could take these first couple of three verses or so and spend a college semester on them and what the meaning of them is and the words thereof. But it's written in very simplistic language so we can understand this example. And so we find that the events it's talking about here, after it came to pass after these things, if you'll look back up here, this is where Hagar and Ishmael was sent out of the camp, and Hagar thought Ishmael had been let out to the wilderness to die. Yet God promised him. God promised Ishmael, or Hagar, that he would be great, and God was with the lad in verse 20, and he dwelt in the wilderness and became an archer. Now we talked about that, and then some thought came up about what does that really mean? Was he just a man of the bow and arrow, or did he hunt? Well, no, we know this is the origin of the Arab people in what we would call the Islamic world today. Turn back over to Genesis chapter 16 and verse 12. I think Reed brought this out last week, but it's worth going over because in our cultural history today, we find a lot said about all this, and the answers, of course, is found in the Bible. Notice what it says here when God made the promise unto Ishmael unto Hagar in verse 12 of Genesis chapter 16. And he will be a wild man, his hand will be against every man, and every man's hand against him. And he shall dwell in the presence of his brethren. So we're going to find really what it's talking about here. Abraham's descendants were going to become problematic for the descendants of Isaac. And needless to say, without going into too much detail on that, because I think we talked about it a good bit last week, we can see that today. So, as we look at the book of Genesis, we are looking at the beginning as the title means. We see what has been put in motion since the flood and where we're at today. So there's a lot we can learn here, okay, from this. And so we find that after these things, that God did tempt Abraham. We're interested in this word tempt used here. A lot of times we think about being tempted, we think more about being tempted to sin, okay? But that's not really the context here of what the Bible is talking about to tempt. I want you to turn with me to 1 Corinthians chapter 10 and verse 13.
Sometimes that word tempted, that means being tested.
There you go, that's where I'm headed.
Yes.
Yeah, that's what it means, being tested. Now what you have to remember here, and I don't want to get too far ahead of myself, but Abraham's faith has been prepared by God for these 49 years or 50 years. Okay? Now it's time to see if Abraham is going to trust a Redeemer more than he is the promise. You see, it's easy to trust in the promise. But now it's time to see if Abraham can live up to what the Redeemer, to what God has prepared for him. That's the real test here. That's the real test. We believe a lot of things, but just because we believe it don't mean we act on it. Well, here we go. Okay, 1 Corinthians chapter 10 and verse 13. 1 Corinthians 10 verse 13. If I can turn there. These old joints just going to kind of stove up a little bit, but we're going to see if we can get them flexed up. So, and we'll just start here because we know it's talking about how Moses led the children of Israel out of Egyptian bondage. And the lot that followed him, it says in verse 4, was Christ. So Jesus was involved in delivering the children of Israel out of Egyptian bondage through the Red Sea and over into freedom. And he goes on here to say, he talks about tempt here, that these people now were not satisfied. They were not happy with what God had done, really. He had let them out into the wilderness. The clothes didn't rot, the shoes didn't rot. He fed them, and all they wanted to do to Moses is complain, you let us out here in this wilderness to die, and we've been better off in the flesh pots of Egypt. I want you to think about that for just a minute. We've been better off a slave under the whip of the taskmaster, scuffing, starving, than what God has done and led us out into the wilderness. That's just ungrateful. Ingrateful.
Low rate in God.
Yeah. And yet, we find today that in a lot of ways, these things are written for us. If we're not careful, it's easy to get into that mode fool, isn't it? To blame God for our problems. Okay? And so we find this is going on, and neither let us, in verse 9, tempt Christ, as some of them also tempted him to destroy the servant. I'm going to jump on down to verse 13. There hath no temptation taken you, but such as common to man. But God is faithful, without suffering you to be tempted above that which you are able, but with the temptation make you a way to escape, that you may be able to bear. So what's it talking about here? We know really when you look at that word tempt in verse 9, like Brother Kahn said, they were really making a mockery of God, wasn't they? They sure were. If you look at the context of it and all like that, you were saying they were doing this to sin. Was it because of God or because of their own lust? And yet we come on down, you see a transition here, that hath no temptation taken you. So we find that there are things that's going to come upon us in life, generally during the natural course of life, that will put us to the test. And it purges our faith. You know, God is in the refine, and maybe 1 Peter chapter 1 will clear that up, read.
In this passage here in 1 Corinthians chapter 10, we often put a lot of emphasis there on beyond your ability, and we focus a lot upon the individual being tempted, and sometimes we miss the importance of the passage, and that's what comes next, is it's not really us. We don't have the strength a lot of times.
Right.
God provides the strength.
God provides us strength.
That's the force of that passage there, is that really this here is to provide the way of escape, is that God makes an end of everything.
Right.
God puts an end to it.
He puts it into it, right. But we have to wait patiently on Him and try not to work it out ourselves, you see. And that's where the disgruntled comes in, isn't it? A lot of times we interject our thoughts and our ways and our feelings and our emotions into it. And we do it sometimes maybe with good intent under the guise of like this. I want to help God out with His plan. Well, I'm not smart enough to help God out with His plan, okay? I need to let God work out His plan and me do my part, and that's provide the belief, right?
That was Abraham and Sarah with Ishmael.
Know that?
That was Abraham and Sarah with Ishmael.
That's it. That's it. They were trying to help God out, you know. And it didn't work out, did it? Matter of fact, it created a lot of problems that we're still feeling the repercussions of today, right now, this minute. And so we find that as we look at this, this temptation here, this trial has to do with the development of faith. If Abraham had not had his faith developed, would he be at the point that he is now, where he's willing to trust in the promises of God? No. It had to be purged, didn't it? God's in the refinery business. God was refining long before BP and Chevron and Texaco went into business, okay? And we know what refineries do. Refineries actually take something that is not useful. Crude oil is just there. It's dirty, it's nasty. Daniel worked in the oil fields. He can tell you a lot about how oil is. It's contaminated. Really what it does is, if it's not properly refined, it's not good for a whole lot. And yet they take this crude, this filthy, dirty, useless, really substance, and they purge out the impurities, and they turn it into something useful. Well, God does the same thing. You know, God's been in the refinery business for a very long time. Abraham's life denotes that. So long before Chevron and Texaco and Exxon and all them came up with a refinery process, we need to go through the Bible and look and see the true refinery process. No. Notice what Peter said here. 1 Peter chapter 1 and verse 6. Wherein you greatly rejoice, though now for a season, if need be, you are in heaviness through manifold temptations. You know, one of the things that really stand out, at least to me it always has, when I begin to realize what the Bible had to say. You greatly rejoice in these manifold temptations. Well, why is that? Because you get to suffer a little bit like Christ got to suffer. And Peter brings that out later on, and that's a subject for another time. And it goes on to say here that the trial that the putting to the test, Brother Con, or the word tempt, if you will, once we understand the meaning of it, that the trial of your faith, the testing of your faith, the put to the iron, the put to the axe, is much more precious than of gold that perish. Though it be tried with fire, might be found unto praise and honor and glory at the appearing of Jesus Christ, whom having not seen ye love, and whom though now ye see him not, yet believe it, ye rejoice with joy unspeakable and full of glory, receiving into your faith even the salvation of your soul. So, what's all that about? It's the perfecting your faith. It's purging out the impurities and turning you as an individual through faith into something useful for God. In other words, God's not running 87 octane. God's not running 93 octane. God wants 100 octane, Daniel. He don't want no octane. You see, God doesn't leave the impurities in there. He wants it purged out. And that's the test that we're put to. That's talking about Abraham. His faith is going to be put to the test now. Abraham, it's time for you to believe the Creator and not let the Creator be producing faith in you. It's time for your part to be done now. I've done my part. So let's see what we're going to do, Abraham. Not to produce faith, but really, this event is to reveal faith. Reveal faith. What it's been leading up to. All these trials and temptations and things of that nature, if you will, that Abraham had, and him trying to help God, this is what it's all. See, God used Abraham's way a lot of times to purge him. You see, in a lot of ways, God will help you out, and God will turn around and use that against us, you see. But it's all a part of the purging process. It's all a part of the purging process. And my understanding is, and I don't know a whole lot about gold, I know it's worth a lot. I know sometimes you think that, well, you know, the country here cutting firewood would be nice if I dropped the axe and a gold mine busted open, wouldn't it? But the reality of it, it's not going to happen. But anyway, my understanding about the perfection of gold, the more you refine it, the more you heat it and boil out the impurities, the purer it is. Okay? So this is what he's talking about here. And yet he says, your faith, your life is more valuable than gold. So God looks at it in a very positive light and not in a negative light. And so this is what he's talking about here, the trial of your faith. I know a lot of times we associate the word tempt with being sin, or being tempted to sin, or acting on lust, but that's not necessarily the meaning of it. It's being put to a test. And God does that. Puts us to a test. It has reached it. He's not going to leave us undone. He's not going to leave us without a way of escape. You know, sometimes man will tempt us, and what does man tempt us a lot of times in various things? Well, man tempts us in a lot of times in a lot of ways because he wants to trap us. He wants to get the upper hand in our life and use this to manipulate something out of us. That's man's temptation. Well, God's not trying to manipulate some tangible good out of us. If anything, he's trying to get our faith to be brought back in line. Read.
Hebrews 12, starting at verse 5. Have you forgotten the exhortation that addresses you as sons? My son, do not regard lightly the discipline of the Lord, nor be weary when reproved by him. For the Lord disciplines the one he loves, and chastises every son whom he receives. It is for discipline that you have to endure. God is treating you as sons, for what son is there whom his father does not discipline? You know, that doesn't just have to do with punishment and disciplining the children there. That's the discipline also takes with the idea of tutoring and bringing someone along.
Yeah.
And teaching them.
And you know, Reed, let's just take a look at this Genesis chapter 22, and I think we've got kind of in there, but it's really interesting about this word tempted, because we need to have a clear understanding of it from a biblical standpoint. And let's just look at this now. And it came to pass after these things that God did discipline Abraham. Kind of fits in, doesn't it? When you stop and think about the big picture of it all. So that's a very, very good point that you made there. And so we find that as we look at this, Abraham, notice his response here in this first verse. And Abraham said, behold, here am I. Behold, here am I. You know, when God went to look for Adam in the Garden of Eden, what was that response? Well, you know, God knew where he was at, but he wanted Adam to own up to it. Adam went and hid himself, didn't he? You don't see Abraham hiding himself. Here I am. Lord, here I am. And so we find that in this here I am really carries with it a little more thought of just being present. It carries with it the idea he was ready to be taught. He was ready to obey. He was ready to surrender. And maybe another thought on this 10th word here is, he was ready to be examined by God. And so this is what's going on here with this, here I am. It's more than just, well, I'm standing here, Lord, what would you have me to do? Really, he's saying, I'm ready. I'm ready for what you prepared for me. So he was ready. He was ready to go. And so we find, God says in verse 2, he said, take now thy son, and notice where this is phrased here, thy only son Isaac. You know, God's only recognizing Isaac, isn't he? That was the promised seed. He was making sure that it was a very clear picture, in which it is now. It's becoming a lot clearer to Abraham that this is not going to involve Ishmael. Ishmael, I'm going to deal with as a separate people, as a different, separate country, as a different nation. And probably a lot of this was done because we know that Abraham, prior to in Genesis chapter 17, had petitioned God on behalf of Abraham when he said, and Abraham said unto God, oh, that Ishmael might live before thee. So, you know, Abraham he loved Ishmael. He was steadily thinking about Ishmael, and so he had petitioned God on behalf, let it be Ishmael. And we find in the next verse what God said. No. It's going to be Isaac. Isaac is born of the rightful woman. He's born of the free woman. Hagar was born of the slave woman. And so we find Ishmael was born by that which was by mankind, by carnality. This son's going to be born by faith. And so we find that he stresses this to Abraham, take now thy son, thy only son, whom thou lovest, and get thee into the land of Moriah. Before we comment on that love, and actually, from what we can see, that's the first time it's used in the Bible. Up until now, it hadn't been used. You know, we've seen a lot of first in Genesis, aren't we? Seeing a lot of first. First time this word's being used. And also you're going to find the first time another word is used, worship. So you see how God is putting these things in order to lead us to today, to these examples that he's given us to study. There's a whole lot more in here than just the narrative, than just the story. And so this land of Moriah has to do with where what we would call, and what would later become, the area of Jerusalem. It's kind of interesting that he sent him to that place in order to sacrifice Isaac. Now we can look back through an eye of faith, and what do we see the importance of Jerusalem? What sacrifice took place there? How many sons did God have? One. One son. How many sons did God recognize Abraham had? One. What kind?
Just one, that's what I'm going to say. But this is also, like you said earlier, a comparison, type and a shadow, because God only had the one son. Now, Abraham only got one, and if he offers him up, it'll be a type of, like Abraham is acting in the person of God,
right?
Or just more or less being compared unto God, that he might be as strong,
right?
And that he might be as strong,
right?
And that's what God wishes for us.
Right.
But see, he knows, God already knows though that he's a free moral agent. And you know, it could be one way today and it could be another way tomorrow.
Yeah.
And so that's the reason he has to be tested.
Right, yeah, and we're gonna see other comparisons, that's just one of many that we're gonna see as this unfolds, as we get to that all. I mean, it's a great parallel here between what's going on and what was going to become, salvation of mankind. And notice it says, in whom thou lovest, okay, he loved Isaac also. And we know the word love is kind of misused in our society today, and the word really means, care and concern for. Daniel Webster, I want to say it was in his 10th edition, and I don't know if it's still in there or not, because these things are revised so often. One of the sub-meanings of love in Daniel Webster's dictionary, and I'll say the 10th edition, I'll have to go back and look and see, but it's right along there somewhere. One of the sub-definitions, you know what Daniel Webster said? God's love for man. And that's still in there. You know, we have a tendency to change words to fit our society, you know. And so we find this word being used, for the first time. And so we see here that this is the context of the love, Brother Con. Here's another parallel between father and son, as you brought out. Now, where else do we see that love? Well, what about in John chapter 3:16? That's a very common verse, but I don't think we hear it so much we don't realize what it means. For God so loved the world that he sent his only begotten Son. What is Abraham being asked to do? To give his only begotten Son. Another parallel, right? Okay? And we're going to see more of these as we go on. To connect, we see this in connection, the sacrifice of Isaac and the sacrifice of Jesus. Okay? Now, you know, when you look at this, we're going to find too that it seems like every command that God gave to Abraham involved in this was a type of knife in itself. And we know what a knife does. A knife can cut to the quick, can't it? The writer of Hebrews says the Word of God is more powerful than a sharpened two-edged sword. It's able to cut to the uttermost depths of the seat of the infection, divide the bone marrow from the bone, so on and so forth. So it's a very sharp knife, isn't it? And just think about this thought here now. Take your son. God took his son. Your only son, Isaac. God took his only son, Jesus. And these are just a few. There's going to be a lot more of them as this unfolds. And notice what it says here. Whom you love. What did it say? God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten son. Offer him. Offer him. Sacrifice him. God sacrificed his son. And of course, in Abraham's day, the way the sacrifice took place was, physically, it was a burnt offering. Meaning that the lamb or the bull or the heifer was slaughtered first and then burnt. So in order for Abraham to carry out this before he could burn the sacrifice, what did he have to do with the knife? Well, you know, in a sense, spiritually, Jesus was offered a burnt sacrifice for us spiritually. And did you know it involved a knife? His flesh was pierced with a spear. It was opened up, wasn't it? I'm interested in it when you look at it. Very often when we read through this, we read it as a story and important. So we don't never look at the parallels here. And you know, one of the things that we're going to find too about this, and I'm going to kind of jump down a little bit, human sacrifice was not unknown at this point in time. Canaanites practiced this, and we know there are other cultures that practice this. We know in our day, when you get down into Mexico and South America, that the ancient Incas and Aztecs did human sacrifices, and there were other groups and other people throughout history, so that's not unusual. So, if the Canaanites had seen Abraham traveling like this to sacrifice his son in that land, they wouldn't have thought nothing about it. So what's going to separate the Canaanite sacrifice from the sacrifice that Abraham's going to make? Abraham's kind of probably wondering the same thing, even though he's on the way to do it, he was human. Even Jesus was human. Jesus, he prayed, let this cup pass from me. The agonizing thought of having to go to that cross. And yet as Abraham walked along, thought and mind was in him like it was in Jesus. Thy will be done and not mine. Sometimes we have to overcome that in our life, don't we? God's will be done, not mine. And that can be tough. No doubt. We don't need to get ourselves. That can be tough. And that's why it's important that we study the Word and we think about it and we meditate on it, because the devil don't want this to happen. He'd rather thwart God's plan, which he tried to do, prior to the flood. He tried to thwart that plan, didn't he? But what happened? The plan carried on. It went right on. And so we find that what Abraham is going to learn, Jehovah God, Yahweh, is different than the Canaanite sacrifices. And so we're going to see that unfold, and we're quickly running out of time here, so that's why I kind of dropped that in there as a point of interest. But I want to go into verse 3. And Abraham rose up early in the morning and saddled his ass and took 2 of his young men with him and Isaac his son, and clave the wood for the burnt offering, and rose up and went into the place which God had told him. Notice what it says here. And Abraham rose up early. Where do we find another example of people rising up early to carry out God's will? Well, when it dawned the first day of the week, it was early in the morning, wasn't it? And the women came. See, God doesn't believe in procrastination. When it's time, you go do it. And so we find that, and the picture we get here is, Abraham being a sheep, as we would say in our terminology today, when we look at the Middle East over there. Abraham was a sheep, really. He was a very wealthy individual, wasn't he? And that's been quite established by him having 318 million able to go into battle when he went to deliver Lot. And yet we find here that Abraham humbled himself. We find humble and humility right here. And Abraham rose up early and saddled his ass. Who did that? Did Abraham have to do that? Abraham had servants, many servants. They could have done that. But if you look at the phraseology here, he did that. That's kind of a humbling thing to a powerful person, isn't it, to have to go out and do something like that. Sometimes we as humans, and let me read that verse for the first time. We as humans a lot of times think there are things beneath us, don't we? Sometimes that interferes with us obeying the gospel of Jesus Christ, doesn't it? To humble ourselves, to bring ourselves down to the point to realize that we're nothing and God is all powerful. A lot of times, people won't do that. And yet we find Abraham now brought himself down to a servant. He saddled it up. And he took 2 young men with him, and Isaac his son, and clave the wood for the burnt offering. It reads like not only did he saddle up, but it looks like he cut the wood for that trip, didn't he? He clave it. Read.
I think with something this monumental and this huge, that this may be almost like a coping mechanism for Abraham. This is kind of him preparing himself and getting his mind into gear to do this type of manual labor to
Sure.
kind of get at it and get the preparation
Sure.
done.
Sure. I mean, and that's true.
Kind of get your mind off of it. And
Yeah.
things.
Oh, sure. Because you got to remember the human factor in this, like the human factor that was in Jesus. So, sure, that could very well be. And so we find that he did these things, and And he rose up and went unto the place which God had told him. Notice that phraseology. Where did he go? Well, I'll just go anywhere. God told me to do this sacrifice. It's too far. It's a 3 days journey or so up to Mount Moriah. It's to where God wants me to go. And you know, I got all this wood and I'm so burdened down with these thoughts and I think I'll go to Prattville. That'll be just as good, won't it? Because it's not about where it's at, it's the intent of the heart. You ever heard that? So that's just as good. You know, that sounds just like what happened to Israel when the kingdom split did, between Jeroboam and Rehoboam. What did Jeroboam tell the people? It's too much for you to go to Jerusalem and worship. So I'm going to set you up a place of worship in the northern part, called Dan. And I'm going to set you up a place of worship in the southern part, called Bethel. You hadn't got to go to Jerusalem to do that. That's too much. Did God specify what to do? He did. He told them where to go. Now, you think if he had went to Prattville for Jack's, that would have been acceptable. He could have burned all day long. He could have slaughtered all day long. Because what did King Saul learn from Samuel? To obey is better than the sacrifice. You see, if you obey, the sacrificing comes natural. That's the byproduct, read.
If he had done it right there, he would have slain Isaac. If he had done it right there, he would have sacrificed Isaac.
Yeah, was Isaac would have died?
For real.
Yeah, yeah, he would have died because it was not in the plan. That was man doings, you see, to have interjected that. And we see what happened when they changed the worship from Jerusalem to Dan and Bethel. There was a train wreck. And you know, you say that, I say train wreck, what did Paul in writing to Timothy say about those two characters? Hymenaeus and Alexander, they had made, in Paul's day, he used the phrase shipwreck of the faith. Same thing. You know? So they created the train wreck. Did God create the train wreck? No. They created the train wreck, trying to help God out there. And I think I'm going to stop right here and pick up at verse 4. I was hoping actually to get maybe halfway through this, and but don't look like we're going to move very fast on this, so we'll kind of pick up at verse 4 next week, and we'll be dismissed for the interim.